why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? A lot of folks out there might not know who you are. You did work with the presidential administration. Was it more than one or just one?
More than one. I was involved as with the President George H.W. Bush administration. I chaired what was effectively his first National Space Policy Committee with some of our country's best and brightest, both from NASA and the military and so forth. That was under the National Security Council at the time. General Colin Powell headed that up, and of course he later became Secretary of State. I later assisted President George W. Bush's campaign with some white papers and policy items on space. That was then, of course, I was also doing work as a consultant to NASA headquarters. I was a former space shuttle engineer, and that led to much of that work. But since 2007, I've been heading up a loose association of scientists around the world who believe, as I do, that the sun is the primary driver of climate change and that mankind has very little, if anything, to do with it. We use solar cycles to predict climate change, and according to some independent evaluators, we do have, at the Space and Science Research Corporation, which I head, the best climate prediction record of any climate research individual or group in the United States. That includes the U.S. government and, of course, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
And when you were working for the Bush administration, were you also working in that capacity, advising on the weather?
No, not then. Back then it was all space programs, since that was my primary career at that point. I really didn't get into climate research until 2007. Oddly enough, I was preparing to retire at that point. Started my first book, which of course people do when they retire in a lot of cases. And when I get into the chapter that dealt with solar activity in that particular book, I stopped that book altogether because I saw what was coming in terms of the next climate change. I also realized many things, especially that we were deceived for 30 years by the UN especially, and more recently our own government, as to the true nature of causes and effects of climate change.
Well, and you're talking about your book. You actually had written a couple of books. One of them was actually, I get the names of them reversed. It's Cold Sun and Dark Winter. And when you're putting those books together and you're looking at what's coming down the road as far as weather and the planet Earth, didn't that kind of scare you as far as what you were realizing as you're putting this together?
Exactly. Every science and engineer and researcher wants to have a Eureka Moment. I basically had that 2 p.m. April the 26th, 2007, when all of the research that I had came together at one instant, and I realized not only the primary cycle of the sun that was about to end global warming and start global cooling, but I also realized that this new cold era that was coming was going to be a potentially dangerous one, affecting every living human being on the planet. So it was a powerful moment. I recall vividly having to get up from my computer, take a walk outside, and get the cobwebs out and think about what I had just found out. And I've been on the mission ever since to get the rest of the U.S., whoever would listen to me, up to speed and up to date and start preparing for this new cold era.
And to get to the specifics, a lot of what we're talking about here, I think that one of the most simple things that we can think of is weather comes from the sun, as far as the heat. If we didn't have the sun, it would be very cold, right?
Yes.
All right. So that's a simple given. Now, the sun, you talked about these solar cycles, and we're currently in solar cycle 24, and it was a low cycle, and some had said, I read that you had predicted the accurate number for the peak of the last solar cycle, which I believe was 74, which other people had overestimated substantially, right?
That's correct. NASA had indicated back in 2006 and 7 that this particular solar cycle 24, which you've correctly named, was going to be one of the most intense ever recorded and would have at least 145 sunspots count at peak. Now, we use sunspot counts as the primary indicator of energy intensity coming off the sun. There are many other ways we measure energy output from the sun, but this is probably the best tool, best parameter we use. Back then, I notified NASA's top solar physicists that they were off in effect by 100% in their calculations. Of course, I had no background in the field, so they dismissed my computations at the time. But every year, NASA and NOAA get together and they come up with their estimates for future sunspot activity or solar energy output. And every year since '07, they've been adjusting it lower and lower and lower, and then finally, within the last 2 years, but officially it came out last month, in fact, from the Royal Observatory in Belgium and from NASA, that I pretty much hit it on the nail's head. Their calculations in Belgium were 74.35, and NASA said on average 72. Well, that's pretty close to the mark.
Yeah. And looking at the sunspot activity, the solar activity, how does that compare? I mean, if you look at the record of the sun and the Earth, what are we talking about here? How do the sunspots affect us on Earth?
Well, again, the sunspots are one of the primary measurements of solar energy output. So if we have more sunspots, the sun's generating more energy, the Earth gets warmer. It's that simple. So when the sun cuts back on sunspots, then it gives us less energy, the Earth gets colder. That happens to a small extent every 11 years, as we learned in high school, the 11-year solar cycle. But on a grander scale, the sun, through much larger cycles, 60, 100, 206, or larger cycles, has very deep reductions in sunspot and energy activity, and makes the Earth extremely cold, potentially dangerous cold, like we had 206 years ago and 206 years before that. And the 206-year figure is the primary cycle that's ended global warming recently and has begun the new cold era. So that's the cycle that's driving us now. It certainly overrides an 11-year solar cycle. But yes, you're right, this current one is very weak. I predicted it would be one of the weakest ever. NASA has finally acknowledged that, yes, it is now the weakest in 100 years.
And does that feel like we're going to go into a dormant period now?
Well, dormancy in terms of lack of sunspots, yes. My Russian colleagues indicate it's going to be much colder and less active than even I'm saying. They say a little ice age has already begun during this particular end of this solar cycle 24. Our prediction is that it will be at least as cold as it was from 1793 to 1830. That was called the Dalton minimum. The previous little ice age, the bottom of it, was called the Maunder minimum. Both names are given to people who studied that period and recorded temperatures and meteorological data during that period. But the new solar hibernation, as we call all of these cold events, is truly already started. We believe we'll get to a point where not only do we drop below the 74 sunspot count for the next two solar cycles, 25 and 26, but we'll be substantially below that. Our Russian colleagues again say we'll have effectively no sunspots for the next 20 to 30 years. If that's correct, then we will in fact be in a new little ice age.
That's something that I think people might not like too much. I've been watching some of the weather issues as far as how it's affected the crops so far in Canada and America, and there have been significant reductions in the what they've already predicted to be the plant yields, the crop yields, and the futures on corn, wheat, already starting to shoot through the roof. It's going to have an impact on our food, isn't it?
A very good point. There's a lot of data out now that shows we've had another delayed planting because of cold and wet weather. as these winter seasons start earlier, are much colder, and they stay longer, we're going to see more of this trend continue. In fact, things have gotten to the point where I issued a new press release yesterday. We're getting it out to everyone we can, but it basically indicates within the next 10 years, global agriculture will be devastated by the rapid advance of this new cold climate.
To put it to, let's say, in a way that people can sort of get a visual on this, there's this famous picture of George Washington crossing the river. What happens in that photograph that people should understand?
Well, we're talking about the Potomac River basically being frozen over, and that's an unheard of event. But back during the Little Ice Age and the Maunder Minimum, and the Dalton Minimum later, the last 206 years solar hibernation, we saw major riverways frozen over. For example, in the Dalton Minimum, 1793 to 1830, the Hudson River froze over, the Thames River in London froze over, and during the Little Ice Age, these rivers, many estuaries, and large areas of the Baltic Sea of northern Europe stayed frozen over so long that they actually built hotels and stores and roads across the Baltic Sea on the frozen ice. I'm hoping that I'm right, that the Russians are not right, but we do share data, we do communicate, and in fact, one of the top Russian climatologists helped me with my book, Cold Sun, and the revision of that book, Dark Winter. Dark Winter is really the new book. It's the one to go to, and it's somewhat updated. So of the two, you don't need both, but I recommend Dark Winter if you're going to get that either one of those books. It tells you all about the history, the cycles, how we've been pretty much deceived by the UN and our own government and environmental groups, unfortunately, whose mission should be just the opposite. But that's what happens when money and politics get involved. They change things just like they've changed the scientific community. We've got many scientists now who've been exposed in these UN climate reports that everyone uses for their predictions for the future. And we found out they've hidden the data, they've falsified the data. In the many presentations I give, I often have people come up to me and they say, we don't believe anyone with a PhD anymore, because of all of the bad press that and the bad conduct and bad science that these scientists have put into these UN climate reports. Some of those scientists, fortunately, have finally stepped forward and said, listen, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have said what we did, and we're now on your side. We're telling the truth about the climate. And that's really what I've been trying to do for 8 years, effective last week.
And there were a number of people. You had put together a petition for people to sign as far as whether or not they agree with the global warming thing. How's that coming along?
Well, thank you for mentioning that. That's the Global Cooling Awareness Project, GCAP for short. It was modeled after the Global Warming Petition Project of Dr. Art Robinson, in Oregon. That project of his began in 1998. After 15 years, they finally had 30,000 scientists, more or less, who signed up saying that global warming was not caused by mankind. The mainstream media doesn't like to discuss those 30,000 scientists, of course, because that contradicts what they've been trying to tell us about in their propaganda supporting the man-made global warming myth. But I spoke with Dr. Robinson a year ago, and I asked for his help, and he completely supports what I'm doing. Basically, the Global Cooling Awareness Project is a online list, if you will. Anyone can go to the website spaceandscience.net, and they can sign up. If you have a 4-year science degree, sign up on the Global Cooling Awareness Project list. It basically asks you to acknowledge that global warming has ended and it looks like a new cold climate has begun. That's pretty much it. But we're only recently began this within the last year, and I hope it doesn't take 15 years like Dr. Robinson's. In fact, we don't have 15 years. We only have 5 or 10 years left before it will be so overwhelmingly cold that the list and its need will probably disappear, and we'll probably have a few thousand signed up by then.
One of the arguments that are made against that petition is that the people that sign it aren't necessarily climate scientists, but does a person have to be a climate scientist to understand what's happening with these events?
That was one of the big criticisms of Dr. Robinson's list, that people were calling in. In fact, some people that were attacking Dr. Robinson called in and phonied up their names and their credentials. That's unethical, of course, but what we've instituted is a background check, if you will, a verification process. And instead of just anyone signing up, we require a minimum 4-year hard science degree. We go back and verify that. And with regard to whether you're a climatologist or not, what we have again found out that some of the world's so-called leading climate scientists were behind the false climate reports that have been issued that we've been putting up with. I would much rather have people who have the good judgment that comes with a science degree to go in and on their own look at this science, make a good value judgment, and give us an honest opinion than have 30,000 PhDs who are dishonest.
Yeah, I can understand that. And there was a skeptical person that was looking at what was happening, and it was kind of an interesting point that this person had made about the global warming. He had said that, well, maybe we are technically going into a global cooling phase, but because of the CO2 increase, it has caused us to go into global warming instead of this global cooling. And of course, there's 2 points to that. I mean, one, he's acknowledging that the global cooling is a reality, but 2, wouldn't you rather be warm than cold?
2 points there. Yes, you'd much rather be warmer than cold. Cold kills crops, most importantly. And because we did have a record period of warmth that began in 1985 and ended around 2003, 2007, we had the largest agricultural production in human history during that period, which we desperately need because our population is growing rapidly and will continue to grow as long as we can feed them. But the second point is, if you look at only a small period of time, for example, the warming period after 1985, and you say, well, this is going to continue forever, first off, that's not scientific. History doesn't support constant trends in only one direction. Nature, according to all the records we have, going back millions of years, is a variable one. We have cold periods, we have warm periods, and the secret that I detected along with many other scientists before me is that these cold and warm periods operate on predictable natural cycles. And for those scientists who believe as I do, if you study these cycles, you can in fact predict climate change. That has been our secret all along. That's why we have the best record in the U.S. according to independent evaluators for climate prediction. We follow natural sun-based climate cycles, and in our global climate status report, which people can also get from the spaceandscience.net website, we actually cover 24 different climate parameters. Very detailed scientific analysis is done on that report. The next one, by the way, is due out June 10th. But even in the December 10 report, we show very clear trends toward global cooling and pretty hard science that supports our efforts, our prediction record. And oh, by the way, CO2 is not even in the 24 parameters.
And one of the things that I read as far as the analysis of the past ice cores is that CO2 doesn't precede global warming situations, it usually follows it. Isn't that true?
Absolutely true. It's one of the, again, the great myth that we heard from Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth and from the President and the UN all along was this false impression that CO2 cranks up and then the heating comes after that. The ice cores, as you aptly pointed out, are quite strong, that it's the other way around. Now, the global warming community will say, well, we're putting a lot more in since the 100 years of industrial revolution began. Well, yes, we are, but it's still a minuscule amount compared to natural CO2. And what we do know after 30 years of research, and even in the most recent 2013-2014 UN IPCC climate reports, they finally acknowledged that the climate is almost indifferent to how much CO2 is in the air. That's why this main pillar of their previous reports was effectively taken out of that report. So now they have finally conceded that the so-called sensitivity of the climate to CO2 really isn't a major factor after all.
And if we look at the specifics of, let's say, the Vostok ice cores, 400,000 years that they looked at, and you can see these really sharp rise in temperature and then the sharp decline in temperatures. And in that period, we see that the Earth typically is in a more of a glacial phase than it is in a warming phase. It's significant, isn't it?
It is. This planet we call Earth is basically an ice-cold planet the vast majority of the time. Only during those brief interludes every 110, 120,000 years after the end of an ice age does it warm up enough where humankind can thrive. Fortunately, we've had a 11,400 year period where the human race has really populated quite well. We have thrived quite well. We have figured out how to grow massive amounts of food to support a new growing population. And unfortunately, what we also find out if we look at those four last previous ice ages, the average is about 11,400 years for these interglacial warm periods before we drop off very quickly, very steeply into the next ice age. There are a few researchers who say we are in fact not just going through a new cold period as John Casey's predicting, but we're actually heading into a new global ice age. I'm not in that camp just yet, but whether you believe the Ice Age camp, the Space and Science Research Corporation, or the Russians, either way, we're in for a very difficult next 20 to 30 years of extreme cold weather.
And this period that we're in currently, the Holocene period, like you said, it's already been a long time. These typically don't last very long. So if we're talking about a little over 11,000 years, it like you say, you haven't jumped on the bandwagon as far as saying, well, I'm not necessarily saying we're going into this complete ice age yet, but it certainly looks like we're heading into a cold spell that will be significant. And we talked about how that's going to affect the food. What happens when you get into a situation where you've got low crop yields, we've got 7+ billion people on the planet? What's going to happen with that?
Well, there's several trends that we're having to deal with during this new solar hibernation that we haven't dealt with before. If you go back again in time and look at each 206-year cycle in the past, and you study the history, what people were like, how they got along, in most cases they didn't. Oftentimes warfare breaks out during these periods because people are starving. Diseases are rampant like the plague because people's immune systems are so weak because they've had a very poor diet. If you go back again and look at history, you find the same patterns. People starve, they freeze to death, they have rampant waves of disease worldwide, warfare, the war cycle breaks out. And this tells us what's going to happen in the future in general terms because the sun is repeating this 206-year cycle. We know that human nature is going to repeat human behavior the same way in responding to the new cold era and the lack of food. However, this time we have a number of trends that we didn't have before. In the past, most people raised their own food. Yes, there were governments, yes, there were nations with large governments, but the vast majority of people lived on farms, they lived in rural and farm areas, not as many in the large cities. But as of 2008, worldwide, more people live in urban areas than they do in rural areas. More people are now dependent on other people, and especially their governments, to give them food than ever before in human history. So this is a very bad set of demographics we're facing now that we haven't had to face before. And even here in the U.S., we have a large sector of the populace that truly believes the federal government will take care of them, regardless what happens climate-wise. And this is disaster too, because this makes people dependent on the government. When the cold starts to kill the crops, as it's already started to do, as the press release we issued yesterday points to, then we're going to see panic set in once the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, makes that first fateful announcement that we've lost 10, 20, 30% of the corn, wheat, and soybean crop because of cold weather and wet weather effects. Then people get scared. What's going to happen happened before. The stores get rioted out of food. They get bought out of food. The farms get attacked. Unfortunately, human nature, we as human beings haven't changed a lot since the Little Ice Age. Our technology has. We've been able to grow more food than ever. But when the cold starts killing the crops, our world will revert to back to what it was before, unfortunately.
Yeah, and one of the things that you had written was that the countries will stop exporting their food because they're going to need it for the internal. So
absolutely, I would not be at all surprised, even under the scenario we predict, a repeat of the Dalton minimum for this current solar hibernation. That the U.S. President and the Premier of Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, will have to stop exporting food because we simply won't have enough for our own people during the worst years, which will be, according to our research, the late 2020s and the 2030s. By the way, that's pretty close. That's not far away at all. And in fact, in the press release that went out yesterday, we said the global devastation will start within 10 years. And again, as you pointed out, there are already early indicators that we've had a difficult spring planting up north. We haven't seen the final data yet. But a lot of people are reporting in the Canadian provinces complete losses of crops like grapes and so forth, that especially on eastern Canada side.
Yeah, one of the photographs I saw this morning was a farmer that was plowing his field in the snow. And of course, the question is, what does he think is going to grow in the snow? I mean, it doesn't seem very possible. On a slight segue, there are other factors that we deal with as far as what affects us here on planet Earth. And one of those, or a couple of those, are volcanoes and earthquakes. And it seems like we're seeing more of those recently. What's going on there?
There's no question about it. The last 10 years have been through the roof in terms of rates of increase for major quakes and major volcanic activity. But this was exactly what we predicted at the Space and Science Research Corporation. The research papers I've personally participated in show a very, very strong correlation between these deep cold eras and the worst earthquakes and worst volcanoes. Take, for example, the last time we had a solar hibernation at the bottom of the last 206-year cycle. Again, that was 1793 to 1830. The worst ever recorded series of major earthquakes occurred at the bottom of that period, 1811 to 1812. That was not in China, it was not in Mexico or Japan or Indonesia. It was right here in the middle of the United States in what is called the New Madrid Fault, that's south of St. Louis. They had two initial magnitude over 7.5 earthquakes, and a final earthquake about 8.0. All of these occurred within a few months of each other. This is a devastating amount of energy release, and of course it caused the Mississippi to flow backwards for a period of time until it redirected. If that happened again today, a great segment of the U.S. economy would go under, because all the bridges across the Mississippi that transport fuel and food from the breadbasket east would be collapsed. This would be a very difficult time to get through. I'm not predicting a new Madrid Fault will erupt again, but we've already seen a major increase, a major spike in the largest earthquakes. Likewise, volcanoes. The one that just occurred in Chile, the Calbuco volcano, is sending a huge cloud of dust towards South Africa. When the seasons were reversed in June 2011, we had another Chile earthquake, Puyehue, that sent a great cloud of dust heading toward Australia, and it shut down air traffic between South America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And even before that, we had a major volcanic eruption in Iceland that shut down aircraft travel throughout Europe for a long period of time. And we now see the evidence that says the cyclical nature of climate also seems to create cyclical patterns in volcanic eruptions. So yes, you're absolutely right, and I appreciate you mentioning that. The worst earthquakes and the worst volcanoes have already started, and more is yet to come.
And where do you think we'll see the activity? We know we have the Ring of Fire. I assume it's going to be in that area. Is that correct?
That's correct. And history also says that Indonesia is where the worst volcanic eruptions hit. There is a lot of research that's been done on the Indonesian volcanoes going back 100,000 years or more. And clearly, just like the last time, 1815, the worst ever recorded volcanic eruption, not the worst ever, but the worst recorded volcanic eruption occurred in Indonesia. It was Mount Tambora, 1815, covered the planet with a veil of dust, and led here in the U.S. to what we call 1816, the year without a summer. And truly, there was no summer for much of the U.S. At that time. We had, in fact, snow and frozen temperatures in the middle of summer, in the middle of August in 1816.
Wow. That's really something. And like I say, we're seeing it happen.
Crops don't grow during that kind of event.
Mm.
We already had 15 years of cold weather before that volcano exploded. So it's kind of like a triple-barrel shotgun, the worst earthquakes, worst volcanoes, and the coldest weather all at the same time.
One of the things that I think scientists saw in 1992 when the Ulysses spacecraft was launched, they'd gotten some data back from the solar winds that shocked the scientists. Can you talk about that?
Not familiar with that particular data point. If you could elaborate, maybe I'll...
Yeah, the launch of the Ulysses was, they wanted to get something out to the edge of our solar system that revolved around us far enough away so that they could get data that would show the solar winds that weren't affected by us being here on Earth. It's hard to measure exactly because of our magnetic field and so on. We don't get exact measurements. So they launched the Ulysses up there, and it went around a few times. And after 3 times around, they saw that the solar winds had decreased dramatically, and the scientists went into a shock because they just didn't believe that something like that could happen so fast. And solar winds, we were talking about the sun's energy activity, and it's directly connected as far as I could see.
Well, then I understand what you're saying now. When we looked at solar wind, and that is one of the things we do track as well, we find it's almost like the sunspots, it's like the magnetic field change, it's like the radio frequency change, 10.7 centimeters. It's like the green spectrum of the auroras. All of these measurements decrease at the same time. For example, the solar wind is now at one of the all-time low points ever measured by anyone, much less 1992. We're far lower now than we were in 1992. And 1992 was on the uptick. Solar wind actually picked up after 1992 and then peaked in the early 2000s. But then after 2007, it began to drop significantly, along with sunspots, along with the solar magnetic field, the radio waves, and so forth. And now it's continuing to drop. And I might add, I just saw the solar output scales yesterday, and we're now at a point where we have almost no sunspots whatsoever. Now, we should be in a declining phase. We've just passed the peak of solar cycle 24, but this is extremely rare to see this drop off this quickly after a peak period. So again, another signal pointing to a new cold era coming, certainly as bad as we're talking about, and maybe the Russians will be correct. We will know the outcome either way within the next 5 or 6 years.
I think so. And one of the things that I've seen, if we look at what happened in the 70s, Time magazine and everybody else had the old headlines, it was the Ice Age. They were screaming the Ice Age. And then came the 80s and 90s and said, no, we're wrong. It's global cooling. And they went down the panic down that road. Do you think maybe they're scared to flip again? I mean, do you think maybe that's why they're kind of death grip onto this global warming thing?
About it. If you go back in history, always history is a good place to start when you're talking about science especially. But if you go back to the 1890s, since that period, we've had 7 flip-flops in climate, effectively, as far as the media is concerned. And you're right. You can pick any one of those 7 periods, including the one we're in now, and see we went from hot to cold to hot to cold, and now we're heading back into the cold, although the media hasn't crossed that bridge yet. They're still talking about warming, even though we don't have any global warming anymore. But that's political, it's not scientific. But yes, in the 70s, the media did talk to the scientists and tried to find out from them what was really happening. Both Time magazine and Newsweek and many others had front page articles about the new little ice age starting all over again. But because they weren't using the same tools or the correct tools back then, they made predictions that didn't come true. That actually reinforced the global warming crowd when global warming reactivated after 1985. But even the global warming crowd, they used the wrong measurement tools as well and wrong prediction tools. That's why I'm so encouraged with this third group of climatologists around the world that I belong to. Because we use solar climate cycle tools, we've been able to come up collectively worldwide with the best record for climate prediction. And if the same tool set had been available back in 1890, we would have never had those flip-flops that we've had every 15 or 20 years.
I think that what we're talking about here is predictive analysis versus responsive analysis. It just doesn't make sense that you respond to things, and that's what it seems like these people are doing with the global warming. They're saying, oh, it's hot, so it's global warming. Oh, it's cold, so it's global cooling. Whereas you're looking at it from the predictive analysis, saying, look, we've got a track record here. We can see what's going to happen. Right. Let's work on that, right?
Exactly. And, it's somewhat a where's the beef question. The where's the beef question in climatology is, okay, show me someone, organization or climatologist who's been able to predict routinely correct predictions. The UN can't do that. They are routinely failed in their predictions. Likewise, the U.S. government has failed to predict accurately what climate is going to do. Again, this third group of climatologists worldwide that study solar climate cycles, we've been extremely accurate, in many cases over 90% in all our predictions. And yet the mainstream media doesn't want to hear that. The current White House doesn't want to hear that because it interferes with their political agenda to tell the truth about what's really happening with the climate, most notably that we can in fact predict its changes to a high degree of reliability.
Well, I think that prediction's especially important right now because definitely when we're talking about the crop yields, not just the crops, but people have investments. Are their investments in the right place? Which kind of brings me to a question with, as far as it goes with your life. I mean, you have an understanding of what's going on. What would you recommend to people as far as where should they live? What should they invest in? And what should people be thinking about today?
I get questions like that and emails and phone calls like that every day. And whenever I give a presentation, I give in many, many TV and public presentations, I usually get questions just like that. Okay, where should I invest? Where should we move to a more southerly climate? Should we move out of the U.S. to the equator? Or, really the gamut of questions in that subject area. I have made it very simple for everyone in answering. I don't tell people what to do with their lives. Every life, every community, every family is different. We all have our own goals and ways of achieving goals. All I do is give you the facts and let you decide where and what you will do and your investments and your location. But on the other hand, I do have some specific recommendations for how to prepare for the new coming cold era.
Okay. And you have those on your website?
Well, again, this is the best question, the most frequent question I get at the end of my presentations.
Yeah.
Number one, everyone needs to recognize that there are major natural disasters that occur, and the governments and legislators can't do anything about it. It's been a long, long time since that has occurred on a global scale, and therefore most people don't feel it. They don't understand the threat that can come from it. If you were around in 1816, you certainly would have seen the global effects of the cold, the volcano, and the years prior, the largest earthquake series in U.S. history. But we only had 5 million people in the U.S. Other than Native Americans at that point. We were a very small, young country, and very little documentation going on. So here's my set of minimum recommendations, regardless of one's goals and financial wherewithal. Number one, we need to cross that intellectual bridge that says, hey, we really haven't been given the truth for 30 years. We need to recognize that there are other explanations for climate change. And then number two is study history. I recommend everyone get any one of a number of new fine books that have come out on the Little Ice Age and on the New Madrid Fault, the Mount Tambora eruption, anything you can find that happened during the last 206-year solar hibernations. And then you'll read what people did, how they got through it, what kinds of ill effects you'll have to deal with during the next 20 or 30 years. And then the third step is fundamental. It basically says, listen, we know that the cold is going to kill the crops. That's our biggest initial threat. So how do you get around that? Well, you can't stop the weather killing crops, but you can make sure you've got at least a 1-year food supply. And if that happens, if everyone in the U.S. did that, there would be no panic. There would be no chaos. And if everyone were told to do that and knew what was coming cold weather-wise, we'd get through it. We'd adapt and we'd press on. The next thing to recognize is that, unfortunately, when people starve, they'll do anything, including get rid of their neighbors, to get their neighbors' food. That's human nature. Again, it's part of history. All I'm saying, and all I have been saying for 8 years, is history's repeating because the sun is repeating in this cycle. The cold is going to start killing crops, and we recognize that basic human nature is going to take hold once people recognize they don't have the food they need to eat. But there's also a positive aspect to my presentations. Number one, by being armed with the truth, you disarm the ill effects or the psychology of panic that sets in. Number two, in every bad climate era, there have been people who've made a lot of money because they knew what was coming. They adapted their lives, their investments, or what have you. So there can be opportunities. I don't want people to just survive the new cold era. I want people to thrive. But you're only going to thrive if you know what's happening, know why it's happening, and then act accordingly.
Yeah, just surviving, that just seems like a bare minimum there, and I agree. You want to do a little bit more. And one of the things that I was thinking is, what would there be something that comes along where people, if we know, many people know that something like this is going to happen, and there isn't a project yet that tries to bring people together and to say, maybe resources that people could look to for how to deal with their situations with maybe the cold where they are, or even the heat. Look at the drought in California. I mean, it seems like there's an opening for a project there somewhere. So maybe somebody who's watching.
Absolutely, yes. I congratulate you on the work you've done to unify groups in the pro-life community. That can happen in the climate preparedness community. Unfortunately, we have a government internationally and here in the U.S. that's staunchly opposed to people like John Casey telling the truth about the climate. They continue to tell us things that are simply not true. It's a very sad time for scientific integrity in our country. That's the lay of the land. We have to recognize that. I have done that, and that's why I've used good organizations like yours and the internet and going out and speaking and getting great folks like Newsmax Media, who started a new nationwide campaign to give away my book in many cases. And by the way, they've just begun a new documentary on Dark Winter. People can see online at newsmaxtv.com or Dish Network or DirecTV. I'm very honored that they've put out the money to put a documentary together. As you know, this is an expensive thing to do. And so the word is getting out, but clearly it's a grassroots movement, and that usually happens when the government is failing the people. The grassroots communities have to take the first steps forward. Then the politicians get in line. But we don't have a lot of time for them to react. We need to start preparing right away.
That we do. And how do people find out more about what you're doing?
Well, thank you. The sources are, first off, go to the website for the Space and Science Research Corporation. That website is www.spaceandscience.net. The word "and" is spelled out, spaceandscience.net. And to get into the book offer, you can go to newsmaxtv.com newsmaxtv.com/darkwinter, newsmaxtv.com/darkwinter, and they've got a free book offer there. Of course, you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and I'm honored to say that my book, Dark Winter, has been in the top 3 or 4 in the top 100 bestsellers at Amazon in terms of public policy, in the climate change category, and in other categories at Amazon.
Great. Well, look forward to seeing more about this, and of course I'm going to read the book. Haven't read it yet, but I will be picking it up soon. And John Casey from Space and Science, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with me and share your information with others, and we hope that people wake up and really start to understand that these are things that we can prepare for. We don't have to be victims.
Peter, thank you for giving me the opportunity to spread some climate truth among your followers. Appreciate it.